We've all seen cookbooks for sale at Target and Anthropologie and dreamed of having our books for sale there. Today, we'll talk to an author who has cracked that code. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for readers, writers, and cooks. This is Kristen Donnelly, and I'm here today with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hey, Kristen.
You know, we're often encouraging our listeners to think about where their books are going to sit on the shelf or be merchandised, right? Like out in the world, even though a lot of books are sold online.
Right. Usually when we say that, I'm imagining like going into Kitchen Arts and Letters or Now Serving or, you know, Barnes and Noble or someplace like that and looking at the cookbook section.
Right. But then there's this whole other part of the market called specialty markets that can move a lot of books. So that includes your non-bookstores like your Anthropologie, your Crate and Barrel, your Williams-Sonoma.
Yeah, any place that sells, you know, cookware or, you know, small independent kitchen shops, they often will I remember when my braising book came, the roasting book too, when those books came out, friends would send me photographs of like small kitchenware shops that would have my book set up next to a roasting pan. And I was just like, that's so cool, right?
Yeah. And it's like, how does your book get there, right?
Yeah. And then when you go and you see I've even seen them like in museum gift shops, or I'm always like, how did that book get there? Like, how did that author get their book into, and especially the big ones like Target, Anthropologie, Crate and Barrel, Williams-Sonoma. I mean, I know Williams-Sonoma, they publish their own books, but they also carry other books.
Plenty. Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Grocery stores, some like high-end grocery stores.
Shops.
Yeah. And the cool thing about having your book there is I think it's a higher visibility because there's less competition. It's been like pre-vetted, pre-selected, that if that's a store that you trust, that you like the taste, the vibe, the style, and they sometimes I think it's as simple as the cover of, you know, the style matches the kitchenware they're doing. But yeah, how do those books get there?
Yeah. And they become impulse buys. I think that's also what's fun. Right. It's like they become an impulse buy or a gift. Like you're like, oh, I'm going to buy this for so-and-so because they love this topic. Today, our guest is Shelly Worcel. She is the author of 4 cookbooks, including the wildly successful Platters and Boards. And most recently, Every Season is Soup Season. Platters and Boards is one of those books that just has sold and sold and sold. Yeah. And I don't know if it was the first book about, you know, charcuterie boards and cheese boards and eating in that style, but it's definitely part of that and one of the bigger ones.
Yeah, it feels like it came out kind of as the wave was crested. Yeah. We'll have to ask her about it.
Yeah, but that book has been sold in Target, in a lot of these specialty shops. And so we're curious how it gets there and just the evolution of her cookbook career overall. Welcome to Everything Cookbook, Shelly. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Looking forward to getting into it. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah. And before we do, let's talk about your cookbook journey. You've had 4 books so far?
I have, yes.
Yeah, but let's talk about how it all began.
Yeah, going back to the beginning, I started how a lot of people my age do. I started with a blog in 2012. It still exists. I don't use it as much as I used to, but it's a vegetarian website. And there's a little bit of an emphasis on Midwest because I am based in the Midwest. Through my blog, I was able to really grow my skills. I learned photography. I learned recipe developing. I learned how to write about food. That is how my agent found me in New York. And she really believed in me. She really wanted to do a Midwest vegetarian cookbook. She thought I was the perfect person for it. Basically, how I got hooked up with Chronicle is that she said, you know, what are your like dream publishers? And so I went through my cookbook shelf and I looked at who had published all my favorite books. And I don't remember exactly who it was. I remember it was Chronicle and 10 Speed. I can't remember the other ones I said. So she basically pitched to those publishers I was really excited about for the first round. Chronicle came back. They were really excited about it. So we ended up going with them as a publisher. So my first book came out, I think it was 2016, and it was called Vegetarian Heartland, Midwest Recipes for Vegetarians. I honestly had thought that's where my book journey would end. I write about vegetarian Midwest food and I put out a vegetarian Midwest cookbook. However, while I was waiting for that book to come out, because as you both know, you write a book and then you give it to your publisher and then you wait a year and a half for, all the edits to happen and for the design and everything. And while I was kind of in that limbo between my first book coming out, Chronicle came back to me and they said, we really loved working with you. You met all our deadlines. You gave us a beautiful book. We're really excited about it. Do you want to write another one? We've got this idea and we need an author for it. Like I said, I had not thought about it. I was like, oh, another one? I just did this. But they pitched me on this idea and it was a single subject book. It was before the trend really happened on Instagram. I think if you say platters and boards, everyone kind of knows what that is now because there was this, huge thing on Instagram where everyone, makes these boards and it's beautiful. It's very visual. But at the time they're like, it's kind of a cheese board book, but you would make themes around it. And I was like, oh, I don't know. That sounds kind of weird. I don't know if like that would really pick up. And they're like, no, we're really excited about this. The one thing is we don't want it to be vegetarian. We want it to have a larger audience. It was like, okay, how am I going to do that? Like, I want to, make this my profession. I want to make sure I'm reaching a larger audience. I don't want to compromise on being a vegetarian because that's what I eat. I don't have any perspective on meat. So we ended up coming to this compromise where my husband actually came in to make the meat part of it. And what's funny about that is that was kind of like what we considered a compromise at the time. And that is something that I get so much feedback on all of my books that people love because you're able to really reach different dietary preferences. I've had so many people say, one person in my family is vegetarian, one person eats meat. I love that your recipes can do both. Anyways, we moved forward with this book. This is my second one. It was called Platters and Boards. That one is the one that I've really had the most success with. That one, it was really fun. Right when it came out in the first 2 days, the first pressing completely sold out.
Whoa.
And yeah, with my first book, I sold, maybe 8,000 copies or something around street. And I think they pressed like 30,000 on my second book. And I would have been so happy to sell 30,000 copies. And it sold out in the second day. And I was like, what does this mean? This is crazy. My editor was like, the only time I've ever seen this, like we've gone on to sell 100,000 cookbooks. We think this is going to be really big. We think you're going to sell 100,000 cookbooks. Live to date, that book has sold 350,000 cookbooks. It just was so fun. I have lots of things I could say about that book, that journey.
I know. Yeah. Maybe we should actually interrupt before we even go to the next book.
I know. I want to go back because there's so much we were going to talk about, and we're going to. You've answered a lot of questions about your second and your third book too. But I want to go back to because a lot of our listeners are sort of starting out and still in that phase of figuring out how to get their first book, and the Vegetarian Heartland clearly seems like it's a extension of your blog and your identity. And that you just explained that that's true. So you started the blog in 2012 and then somewhere a couple years into there, your agent reaches out to you. And so the book is really a natural extension of the work you've been doing. But then the escalation that happens after that is very interesting. And I also think that for listeners, that what you just said is really important, that you had an idea of what publishers you would like to work with. And obviously that doesn't always work, but having that sense of where your work might fit. I mean, Kristen, you teach your cookbook proposal boot camp, and I would think that's something you talk to your students about as well, right?
For sure. Yeah. For just getting an idea of where your book fits on the shelf and the publishers that are publishing the types of books that you like to do.
Yeah.
And then that idea of your second book being like platters or boards, I don't even know what that, it's not a part of what I do, but how you were able to say, okay, well, this is an opportunity.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be an incredible one. But to stay true to, sure, I can get around that by bringing in Wyatt, your husband, to do the meat. And then that becomes part of, the identity of the next 3 books, really. So Platters and Boards came out 2018. So like quickly after Vegetarian Heartland.
Yes.
And then a few years later, Tables and Spreads.
Yes. A few years later, Tables and Spreads. I will always remember that came out in 2021 because I was finishing it in 2020, right when the pandemic was starting. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm making an entertainment cookbook right now. And there's a global pandemic happening. So that came out in 2021. And then my newest book, Soup Season, came out in 2023. And I was just going to go back really quick with my first book. I had this vision of what I wanted and I got it. I got the publisher I wanted. And, my agent was very just tempered my expectation. She's like, you might not get a hardcover, you might not get, colored, this is your very first book. Let's start from the beginning. And then for your next book, we can try and pivot and things like that. And I did get hardcover, I did get color photos and everything. But then when we went to my next book, that was another thing where it was like, well, I don't know if this is what I want. And my agent, who is amazing, I really advocate for an agent that's going to advocate for you. She said, you made a very niche book. It's a Midwest vegetarian book. That audience is not huge. You're going to have a loyal following that's going to get that. But by getting a second book deal now, you don't have to worry about if those sales are not that great for your first one that's very niche. So that was like another opportunity where it's like, okay, well, let's get started on the second one now. We know there's a deal on the table. We don't have to worry about potentially the first one not selling super well and then having trouble getting a second deal. It's so funny when I look back now, because that second deal, I was like, I don't know if this is what I want. And then it's led to so many opportunities down the line. So I think for me, it was like, let's always go in, let's give it our best, let's make a beautiful product. And then from there, we just need to be open to opportunities that come from that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also good to know there is this reality that some books start with the publisher.
Yeah.
They really see the market and they're like, this book has potential to do well. And then they often find the author. And the way they find the author is often somebody they've worked with who has done good work. And it sounds like they really liked working with you on that first book.
Yeah.
The value of being nice to work with. It's actually huge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I had never imagined myself as this, I had made my first book around my brand. And then once I pivoted this single subject area, it was like, wow, I love this. I'm an introvert. I actually don't like being the center of attention. And so this way, I focus instead on making beautiful books and based on what people want. And then at the end of the day, it's about a beautiful product. It's not about me. And I love that. And so for the second book, the third book, and the fourth book, I all came to the publisher with ideas. And my editor was very nice. She's wonderful. She was like, these are great, but what about this? This is what we actually need. And at the end of the day, they're the ones they're actually in it day to day. So they know what they need. And so it's like, I would rather make a product that I know people are going to want to buy at the end of the day than something that is going to be my own vanity project. Because I love food. I can get excited about most things.
Mm-hmm. The Vegetarian Heartland book is still in print.
It is still in print. Yes.
I've often thought like that if you have a second book that does, gets more attention than your first book, or a third book, that it helps move the first book. Like people discover you through whether it's platters or boards, tables and spreads, soup season, and then they go back and find your first book and they're like, oh.
Yes, definitely. I definitely have seen sales increase on my first book. I think that all the places that platters and boards ended up, that just helps the sales of all of my books, even my future books as well, because, we're kind of jumping around. But with my third book, I really went into it and they're like, okay, your second book did great. What are your goals here? And I was like, I want Target. I want to see my book in Target. I love Target. We've already gotten in Anthropology. We've already gotten in Crate and Barrel, Williams-Sonoma. I really would love Target. So they pitched my third book to Target. Target was like, well, I don't know. And, they gave obviously sales numbers on my second book. And they're like, we're going to pass on this book, but can we bring in the second book that came out 5 years ago? So they didn't even start carrying my second book until several years after. Something else that's really fun about that is that they don't, like, I'm never going to compete with, some of the celebrity chef books, which you usually see in Target. And so my book is still in Target now, Platters and Boards, but it's not with the cookbooks. It's actually in the gift section where the wrapping paper is and where, the bags are and cards are and things like that, because they're merchandising it as a gift instead of a book. So it was kind of a really fun way that I'm very impressed that, when I say we mostly chronicle, but they got creative to get to the goal that I wanted in the end for the book. And although they haven't gotten tables and spreads there yet, they were able to get one of my books in there just because of how everything shaked out.
That's awesome. And how much influence were you able to have on that? Or was that more chronicle led and then?
So it was a little bit of both. So what's funny is, again, this is totally different than how I handled my first book. But with my second book, when they pitched me on the idea, they said, a big thing is we love your photography. And what we want is we want this to be a gift book. So we want a lot of merchandising with it. So they actually went into it being like, we want you to be using West Elm items in your props. We want you to be using Williams-Sonoma items. We want you to be using Anthropologie items. This is the color we think Anthropologie is going to be favoring for the displays when the book comes out. Keep that in mind. So we went into the whole process keeping those merchy kind of things in mind. So then when it was time to go promote it and for them to sell the books, they could be like, oh, we have Anthro products in the book. We have Williams-Sonoma products in the book. And I don't know if that's helpful always, but I know in our case, it really got us in the door for sure.
So this is for your third book after you've already had your second book that was in non-traditional bookstores.
This was for both. So we went into it for both the second and the third book with those goals in mind.
That's really interesting, though, like the propping, like thinking of.
But I'm just thinking if an author didn't have that relationship with the publisher and the author was just like, I want my book and I'm going to do all these things. I don't know if every publisher would get on board with that or,
right.
I mean, it really sounds like it was a partnership.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about the sort of evolution from Platters and Boards, your second book, to Tables and Spreads, which are similar. The second one, the Table and Spreads is more entertaining based than the first one. But when you do two books, single subject books that are, I don't know, they're not volume 1 and volume 2, but they're very closely related. How do you distinguish those two books?
Yeah.
Say, I already bought Platters and Boards. How do you make me want to buy Tables and Spreads as well?
So we definitely went into the third book feeling like it would be a companion piece to the second book. This is where, again, like I pitched my publisher on a lot of ideas that I wanted to do for my third book. And they came back and they're like, can we just do another Platters and Boards? And they were like, we really just want another one of these. And so that was definitely a big hurdle where it was like, how do I make this unique? Because I wanted to feel like a continuation of Platters and Boards, but I wanted to stand on its own too. Platters and Boards really felt like an introduction for people. Again, this is right when that trend was kind of exploding. So for Tables and Spreads, I wanted it to go a little bit deeper. So there's a lot more instructions in there. For example, not anytime, but a lot of times when I would get feedback, people would be like, I made your boards. They're beautiful. They don't look like your photos at all. And like, like, how do you make them so pretty? How do you? And so I took all of that feedback. And then, so I kind of like Tables and Spreads more because it was, hindsight, I was able to see what people actually wanted out of the book that they felt was missing from Platters and Boards. And so for my third book, I really took all of that to heart and I did a lot more instructions. It's a lot more about the visual aspects. It's a lot more about entertaining and making it beautiful for when you have people coming over and just more in depth than the first one, which is a little bit more of an intro.
You have floral arrangement, you have color schemes, you have, a lot that's not just food.
Yeah. And it's funny because we talked about how, on this show and out in the cookbook world and trends, people talk about how like the E word, entertaining, like we don't want to do books about entertaining. And yet this book is about entertaining and people love it,
Yeah.
It's updated.
Well, it's updated too, and it's certainly not simpler, but in many ways it's a more casual approach. It's not a multi-course. It's not a sit-down. You put out a spread and you engage with your guests at that level kind of thing. You talk about that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big part of the books that I make too, that I always, talk to people about is I'm not a professionally trained chef, not a professional caterer, entertainer, anything like that. So I'm coming at it from a home cook's perspective. I'm coming at it from someone who entertains, has people over on the weekends, but I don't do this professionally. So everything is doable. It's all relatable. I know what people want because I'm that person. I don't have any sort of professional background in entertaining, in food or anything like that. It's just from the love and obsession of doing these things for over a decade.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Everything Cookbooks, but it does take resources to make it happen. So I'd like to invite you to help us keep the lights on. For ways to support the show, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There, you'll find links to any upcoming insider events where we go even further behind the scenes of the cookbook publishing world. You can also leave us a review, order books through our affiliate page, check out our t-shirts, sweatshirts, or other merch, or just buy us a round of coffee. Every little bit of support really helps keep the show going. And thanks for listening.
I'm curious how the cookbooks fit into your overall career.
Yeah.
For you, like what are you often working on in addition to the books?
So it all depends. The cookbooks, I really love writing cookbooks. I love doing the cookbooks. At one point, as I had mentioned, when I first started out, I was focusing more on blogs, brand partnerships, the kind of things that were happening in the mid 2000s. Since then, I did not jump on the TikTok video trend and, what's kind of really popular on social media these days. Instead, I kind of decided I want to keep focusing on the book angle. So I do my own cookbooks. I also photograph other people's work as well. I have a friend who has a cookbook coming out in the fall. I just finished photographing their cookbooks. I'm working on some merch items for my book. So I also really love the photography angle. That's probably my favorite angle after cooking. Cooking would be my number one if dishes didn't exist, but at the end of the day, they do. So I really have been enjoying photographing other people's work and working on that angle as well. You both probably know how you kind of have to have your toes in a couple different things, and it just depends on the season. So right now I'm kind of in a photography season. I'm excited to hopefully get working on a new cookbook soon as well. And I'll probably get back into the cooking season when we get to that point.
And when you say you've done some brand work and still do some brand work, I think some partnership, what kind of work are you doing with them?
For a while there, I was doing a lot of sponsored content on my blog. I've also done photography for brands. I've done recipe development for brands, done recipe development for like food and wine. I've had recipes in Bon Appetit. I've done those kind of things. I shifted away from that kind of brand partnership a lot more when I started to kind of ramp up on the cookbook stuff. So I haven't done that as much in the last couple of years, but that's something that I definitely, especially as I was just building up my chops to kind of start writing books as well. It's all experience to get better at recipe developing, understanding, what people like. And basically, I would take any work I could get until I kind of got to a point where I felt really confident about everything I was doing.
Do you think those brand partnerships, have they helped at all with the sales in any way?
Yeah, I think so, because usually I will reach out to those brands when I'm starting the promo. I was doing a lot of photography for the kitchen for a while, and they were a really great brand partner on the last book. And, it really just depends. I've done stuff with West Elm, and that was, during my second book. So I definitely keep that in mind when I'm working with those brands, like, oh, I'm going to keep your contact on file. And I think it definitely helps. I think for me, I'm based in Bloomington, Indiana. And so I'm not in New York where I could be, bumping into people all the time, reminding them about me and my books. And so for me, through work is really where I'm able to kind of network a lot more.
Mm-hmm. When we first started to talk about having you come on and talk to us, one of the things you said was that you don't have a very big social media platform.
Yep.
I think you're around 42,000 followers on Instagram. And I think for some of our listeners, that would feel like a pretty big platform. So I guess the question is, was it the publisher who said that wasn't a big platform? It's just you comparing yourself, and how has that platform grown?
Instagram, for sure. I feel like that's kind of like a mid-level. I think a lot of people are getting recognized right now on TikTok. I don't do a ton on TikTok. And so I haven't grown a ton on Instagram, I would say, in the last couple of years. So when I did do my first book, I was probably maybe like 10,000 less than that. So at the time, it maybe felt like a lot, but I haven't seen a ton of growth since then. So it's not really where I'm putting my focus. I'm just not content creating all the time. And I think that's an angle that a lot of people do. And I think it's great. And I did do that at one point. But now that I kind of have my foot in the door, I would rather focus on creating beautiful products instead of focusing on creating a brand around myself, if that makes sense.
It does. It's interesting because it's kind of like you said, you were building your own brand. And then it's funny. So I'll be 100% honest here. I knew you and your brand, and I have your first book because I liked the brand. And then I knew about Platters and Boards, but I actually didn't make the connection that it was the same person because I knew you as Vegetarian Ventures.
Yeah.
It is just an interesting shift where the books are books that are going to sell partially because of you and your sensibility, but it's also because that it's something that people are interested in anyway.
Mm-hmm. And they're beautiful packages. Yeah. And I really, the reason I bring this up, because I think, we hear so much about platform, and when we talk about building it, and yes, it matters, but it's not the only way. I mean, your book sales numbers are, very impressive. Over 350,000 copies of, so it's not just having a big social media platform. It's not the only way to cookbook success. So I think it's really worth stressing for people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially in the single subject, if that is something people are interested in, because that's really where you're gonna be focused on a topic instead of, yourself or your brand. And so as I mentioned, I mean, I kind of breezed over it. There was obviously a lot of work that went into before getting that cookbook deal of meeting these brands, working with them, recipe developing, getting my name out there in that way that I could then find people that would then connect me to these deals. So it's like, I'm not breezing over it. Like you have to, if you want to do a book and you want to do the photography, you have to be good at recipe development. You have to be good at writing. You have to be good at photography. But if you do that and you're able to create beautiful products and make those connections, I do think that there is a way to market your books that don't have to be about you and your social media following, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And that's not to say that I don't promote them. Like I was just mentioned, I think I mentioned to one of you before, I went on a small cookbook tour last week, and it was like, not like I'm hitting LA, New York, those really big markets. Instead, I'm just hitting the ones that I know I have fans in. I went up to Ann Arbor, I went up to Michigan, I'm just doing small Midwest tours to get a select number of fans, and I'm going to sell, maybe 50 books on those, but that's not going to drive, most of my sales. 50 books isn't going to be enough to be enough sales for the year.
Right. It's something I've talked about before on the show, is like embracing like where you live and becoming like a little bit of a, regional hero or hometown hero. And the fact that you're doing that, I think is great, because I'm sure people love seeing you, and you sell some books. So
yeah. And 50 is not nothing either. So it's, this is a little bit of a side we hadn't, but you changed your name during the course of your cookbook career. Your first book, I think, was before you were married.
Yes.
Vegetarian Heartland has your maiden name, right?
Yes.
That's just an interesting decision. I'm curious how that came about.
I feel like it just confuses people. So it's like I started, my first book has my maiden name, and my second book has my maiden name, which is Westerhausen, which is already a mouthful. And so with my third book, when I had changed my name, they wanted the third book to be merchandised near the second book. So they were like, we want to keep your maiden name on there, but you can also add your new last name. So now it's like all my cookbooks are both my maiden and my last name, which is such a mouthful, Shelly Worcel. And so it's like, ideally, I would have started with, my married name, and then it would have been consistent across them all. But my publisher doesn't want to ever drop my maiden name because that's tied to my biggest book sales. So now we just have a mouthful always.
Yeah. No, I only ask it because I'm sure it does come up for some authors who go through name changes, and you have to make that decision, especially if you decide to change your name in your personal life. So
yeah, and it was a big conversation. I mean, it was not something where it was like breezed over. It was definitely a big conversation between me and my publisher to be like, how do we do this consistently?
Now, your most recent book, every season is soup season. Is this a similar like origin story where, because you kept saying like, I pitched these ideas to the publisher and they're like, what about this?
Yes, exactly. So basically, when I went to pitch this book, I had pitched, and it's so glad that we didn't go with it, but I had pitched this idea of like, I feel like the whole platters and boards trend has gotten out of control. Like there's just like fry boards where it's just like a bunch of fries and ketchup. And like, they're just like, everyone had started getting into these mass like tables full of food. And it felt like it had really gotten out of control. So I was like, I really want to pitch a like coming back to like mealtime snack idea. So just like having dinner with a couple different items and things like that. My publisher was like, oh, I think it's too basic. I don't know if we like it. And now I'm so glad we did, because right when my book came out is when the like girl dinner trend happened. And it was like, oh no, this would have been a girl dinner book. So in the end, it was fine, because it was essentially the exact same idea that I had pitched them, was like, oh, this is girl dinner before it was named. But anyways, they were like, yeah, that's nice, but we have a couple other ideas. They're like, someone just dropped out of, we really need a soup book. Would you do that? And so I was like, yeah, sure. I love soups. What's funny about that is we really had a hard time figuring out how to market it, because it's a soup book, but it's also a leftovers book, because if you've seen the book, every soup then has a new recipe to turn it into a completely new recipe if you don't want to have it as leftovers. It was also, soup is a single subject, but it's so overwhelming. Like when I first started thinking about the topic, I was like, there are so many different kinds of soups. Every time I asked someone, what's your favorite soup? I would get a different answer. And I realized there is such an emotional attachment to soup that is not attached to a lot of other foods, because soup is comfort to so many people, and comfort is something different to so many people. So they're like, we want a soup book, but then it ended there, and it was up to me to figure out, what does that mean? And so I did not want to make an encyclopedia. There's just too many out there. So I started seeing what was in the market already, and I love soup, but I feel like it kind of has a little bit of like a frumpy association with it. It's kind of like a little bit like it's economical. It can be, some people can find it like a little boring. And I really wanted to make a modern soup book that was really, if you look at my photos, they're very punchy, they're vibrant. I wanted it to feel like a modern soup book, if that makes sense. So in the book, you'll see like half the recipes are soups you would expect. Basically, I just had to pick my favorites because everyone had different favorites. So, we've got corn chowder, we've got broccoli cheddar, etc. And then the other half, I tried to make new recipes for people who wanted like a more modern take on soup and something that they might not expected. Like there's a baba ganoush inspired soup recipe in there. There's a couple other ones. So long story short, basically my publisher was like, we want a soup book. But then it was like, where do I take? There's so many different directions you can take it with. And so that's kind of where I came up with Soup Season. They also wanted it to just be called Everyday Soups. And I was like, that's so boring. And so I had pitched them on a bunch of titles, and this is the title we had come to. So that was just kind of the transformation between here's an idea, and then it was like, where do we take this?
So the idea, the reinvention idea, which is something, we've seen books that have incorporated that, but this is throughout. Every soup recipe has at least one, or if not two, completely different applications. You take the leftovers and that was something you came up with to make this stand out.
I can't remember if my publisher and I worked together on that topic, but yeah, that was like a secondary topic that came up. And really that came up because, and I throw him under the bus all the time, but my husband doesn't like leftovers, which is crazy and annoying. And so it was like, how do we repurpose this? And so, yeah, that was me trying to, find a fresh take on a soup book to make it different and also to work based on our lifestyle. And it's funny because if you look at my second and third book, I throw so much at people. Like there's the main recipe, and then there's a meat suggestion. A lot of times there's a drink suggestion. There's sometimes a serving suggestion where I tell you, how to display it. So it was like, okay, there's a lot that I'm trying to convey in this soup book. And they're like, if anyone knows how to figure out how to convey all that, you'll do it, because I tend to just overthrow things at people. So again, the soups have a meat suggestion in them. They have a leftover suggestion. They have, I don't remember the exact term we use, like a jazz up suggestion where you can like drizzle a sauce on it. You can add some crunchiness to it. So that's my people pleasing side, where I just kind of throw too much at people. But hopefully I think we do a good job of trying to kind of convey that.
Yeah, and then you've got enhancers and accompaniments in the back too. So it's not, and it's a good example, I think, for people about like soups is a crowded area. There are a lot of soup books, as you already said, Shelly, and so, but it's also one of those evergreen topics that publishers need a new soup book every now and then. So it's a good example of how you take a topic that's been done a lot and make it fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So when you're working with a publisher, sounds like so much is very collaborative. And in those early stages, what do they want to see before they get a manuscript?
For me, since we've kind of already worked together, usually they will ask for a recipe list. If I have like one or two photos or, a vision for the visuals, that's always helpful. But usually we can skip like any sort of, sample recipes or anything like that where I actually have to give the recipe. We'll review the list of recipes I've written up. And I'm always very transparent, and they're always totally understandable that those recipes usually change, at least like 30% of those recipes are going to change throughout the process as I go through. And then we'll do a early manuscript turn in where we just make sure everything's looking good after, I don't know, I think it's 3 months or whatnot. And then obviously the final manuscript as well.
So no formal proposal at this point?
No, we're not doing it yet.
And what sort of timeline is average for you on these books?
My first book took me 4 years. My second book took me 2 years. My third book took me 18 months. And then this one I did in about 18 months. So getting a little faster with each one.
And are you talking about from idea to publication, or are you talking about like to do the manuscript?
From when I get the green light that we're going to move forward with the project to when I turn in the photos, which is usually a couple months after the manuscript. Yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah. And you're doing all of that, which is a lot. Yeah.
You're doing the photos. And it sounds like your husband does some of the photos. The two of you do photography together?
If I can rope him in for the day, he will help. He will help assist, but I do the prop styling and the photos and the cooking and all that.
So maybe it's on the earlier books. I saw him with a photo credit.
He usually assists for sure. Okay. So yeah, he might have taken a few photos.
Yeah.
He's good at, if I, tell him point in this direction, press this button, he'll do it.
But otherwise you're doing the styling, the propping,
I am.
the cooking, the photos.
Yeah. Yes.
Just like work-wise for that flow, I know people do it differently. Are you doing like a lot of development and then you go back and do the photos, or are you kind of doing like one by one?
Each time I play around with a new way to see if I can kind of become more efficient each time. So I've done where I will do the whole manuscript and everything, and then I'll go back and do the photos. With my newest book, I kind of went back and forth because I found that sometimes your palate just needs a break, especially when some of those recipes that I was trying to perfect, particularly the ones that had a lot of expectations around them, like the tomato soup recipe. Everyone has a way they think tomato soup is going to taste. So it took me forever to get my perfect tomato soup. So I actually would go back and forth between the two. I would do a couple weeks of recipe testing, and then I would do a couple weeks of shooting when I felt good about it. And then I would go back to testing. And that kind of really helped from getting any sort of burnout in the flow of everything.
And you're incorporating more lifestyle or some lifestyle photos as well, especially in soup season. Yes. There's some sort of atmospheric photos.
So that's something, yes, we've done with all of my books. It's something that, my publisher really has pushed me towards, and I really enjoy that aspect. So what we have done with the last, I think 3, I'll do a lot of the photos as we go along. And then I will rent out a place for usually a week. And then that's when I'll bring in some assistants and my husband and whatnot. And we'll try to knock out a bunch in a beautiful place, for beautiful lifestyle photos. So for the last book, we went up to Traverse City and we took photos on Lake Michigan. I think most times we do something on Lake Michigan because it's beautiful. Definitely lifestyle is a big part of it.
Do any art directors or anyone from the publisher ever come and...
No.
Design, what's the process like? After you submit everything, working with Chronicle on the design elements?
They do all the design, and they are luckily very open to feedback. So we usually do go back and forth. The one thing that they do not ever, and maybe you guys have experienced this, maybe not, but they don't ever bend on the cover. I feel like I never get the cover that I want. And at the end of the day, it's their decision. They know how to market it, but that's the one thing where it's always just like, what about this one? And yeah.
Funny. Soup season has such a cool, it's kind of retro but modern at the same time, very colorful, poppy. Do you come to them with that vision, or is that also fairly collaborative?
That just is how I'm photographing in the moment. So when I was photographing soup season, I had just moved into our current home, which is this mid-century modern home. And I just would find little nooks and I would photograph, kind of based on how I was feeling at the time. So I actually, and the same thing happened with this book I just photographed. I don't really ask Chronicle's permission on anything. I just give them what I do. And then they've never really come back with issues with the photos, luckily.
That's sweet.
So soup season has a deck?
Yes. So we've got a soup deck coming out.
Let's talk about what that is and how that happens. And
that's another one where it's I put my expectations out there. I put my dream list out there. And so with tables and spreads, I had actually really wanted, so as we mentioned, it's an entertaining book. And I had really wanted to do a notepad with it that was a planner for entertaining. I'm a Virgo. I'm a planner. And so I had this vision where I wanted there to be this companion notebook that listed shopping lists, plates you would need, and all this kind of timeline. It would have a timeline, all this stuff. And they were like, it's the pandemic. I don't think people need this right now. And, they scrapped it. But they came back to me with soup season 3 years later, and they're like, we know you like this merchy kind of stuff. What do you think about doing a soup deck? These decks are really popular right now. So that's kind of how we got the idea. And basically, it's kind of like cards, but they're bigger, and they work really great on, a coffee table as a gift, things like that. And so they will be recipes from the book as well as new photos and a couple additional new recipes. And that'll be coming out in the fall.
That's cool.
So a year after the book was released. So they're recipe cards. So there's a recipe on one side and a photo on another.
Exactly. Yep. And so I have not seen those in person yet. I'm really excited to see those. I think it's going to be a really fun, just companion piece to it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think it just plays back to, again, my books do so well in non-traditional stores. So, those gifty kind of stores. I mean, it's just so funny to hear the places it ends up. Like a lot of times the book is in like botanical garden gift shops, museum gift shops, just like those kind of places that do really well with, just like a table display of gift items.
Right. And I'm guessing a deck is probably a lower price point than a book.
Yes.
So you could pair it with put a pot and put a...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think they wanted to wait 1 year later because then it'll be fall again, which tends to be peak soup season. Right. It's always soup season, but there is peak soup season. Yeah.
I want to make sure, are you getting royalties?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So it's not a work for hire situation.
No, it's not a work for hire. Yes, definitely. I am living off those royalties. I need those royalties.
Yeah, that's great. Because I know sometimes with books like this, sometimes publishers will try to create a work for hire situation, which means you basically get a flat fee. There's no royalty attachment to that. And as much as possible, I like to try to dissuade people from those kinds of structures because, like, what if a book sells 350,000 copies and you don't have royalties attached to it? So
yes, I feel the same way. Yeah, with my second book, my agent, she really pushed for higher royalty rates after a certain amount of books. She kept nailing into it and they were going back and forth. And I was like, I don't care. Let's just get this deal done. And now I'm so glad she did that because I could have never imagined selling 50,000 plus books. And now it's like, it's where most of my income comes from is my royalties.
Yeah. And it's interesting though, Shelly, because you single subject books, they're not that closely associated with you as your brand, but you have built yourself. I mean, they are now. So I think some work for hire, you almost don't. I mean, I've done some early in my career where my name's not even really on the cover, and so that's a different situation. But in yours, you really are, part of, it's a single subject, but it's branded by Shelly Worcel. So it really, that's a big selling point for it at this point.
Yes. Doing all those kind of partnerships, it's like when I went to go pitch, it's like, well, I've done recipes with Food and Wine, I've partnered with these brands. So it's like building your piece there is helpful, but also, the name recognition is for sure helpful. On this new book that I photographed coming out in the fall, my name is going to be on the cover. I do think that there is a little bit of pull there, knowing that I photographed this book and having the experience that I have for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. That's not usual for a photographer to be on the cover. Yeah. Usually it's the title page. So yeah, that's awesome. What is your advice to a listener who maybe has a really good single subject book idea?
The main thing would just be make sure, first off, that you're just honing your skills. So making sure that you're able to bring as much to the table as you can. So if you can do photography, if you can do the writing, if you can do everything, that's going to probably, that's going to be one less person the publisher is going to have to look for. So the more you can bring to the table, the better in that way. And then also just trying to make some connections that could then lead you to an agent or a publisher. So, trying to maybe be an assistant to a photographer, a food photographer, or being an assistant to someone working on a book, trying to kind of get in that industry in that way. Like I said, I'm based in the Midwest. So, I'm not bumping into people all the time. And this was kind of my way to kind of make connections and find my way into the industry.
And I mean, we'll certainly put links to all your books and also your website. And so people can find out, get a sense of your photography and the work that you do. We'll put that in the show notes.
That sounds great.
Well, thank you so much, Shelly. This is really, really great.
It's great to talk to you.
I really appreciate you guys having me.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned here can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks as always to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.